And soak up all this amazing stuff that you have in store. So, hi, Chip. You're good to go.
Is it working?
Yes,
working. That's excellent. Working better than I am. Well, good evening, citizens. I deliberately call you citizens because we are all equal. And that's one of the messages of Reclaim the Enlightenment. Reclaim the Enlightenment was founded in 2017. Inspired by, would you believe it, Belfast's progressive era, in which the citizens of the time indeed decided that everybody was equal, including visiting freed slave, Irada Equiano, and they demanded not only equal rights, equal voting rights, rights for women, a free press, free and universal education, and so on and so forth. Now that radical impetus was largely crushed along with the 1798 rebellion, and has never really fully resurfaced. It is the aim of Reclaim the Enlightenment to use that 18th century generation as an inspiration to seek change in our own times. One of the issues, as I've already mentioned, which those 18th century radicals were impassioned about, was slavery and the need to abolish slavery. Well, here we are, more than 200 years later, and not only does slavery still exist worldwide, but in fact, according to a recent statistical assessment, there are still people in the British Isles who are in a state of slavery. I gather that you were visited this morning by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who apparently survived the cut and lives again under the third new Tory regime of recent weeks. And of course, when it comes to creating the problem of slavery, the immigration policies of the Conservative government largely created. I say we are all citizens. That is not the view of our present government. Our present government certainly does not define refugees, let alone people seeking a better life, as citizens. Hence, a lot of the problems that face the immigrant community today, and those are all things that need to be challenged. The little piece you're going to hear now is is two voices. One is the radical voice, but the other is the one that actually believes we never had anything to do with slavery in Ulster or Ireland, and one who believes there is a huge problem still to be resolved, and another who sort of mixes bigotry and racism with an argument that really we don't need to do anything about it. And those are the contrasting voices of today. Well, I know which side Reclaim the Enlightenment is on. If you're interested in Reclaim the Enlightenment, we have various pamphlets on sale, and also it's possible to join Reclaim the Enlightenment for the massive sum of £10 a year or £5 a year if you are unwaged. Well, that's the boring bit. So now over to Paula McFetridge and Vincent Higgins, who are going to perform Slavery Now.
So, you have come here at last to apologise for Ulster's role in the slave trade.
Ulster says no. We didn't trade in slaves, and we had no sympathy for the business. Oh, and by the way, Ireland says no too. We were slaves ourselves, weren't we? Didn't Cromwell send us as slaves to the West Indies?
That is a red herring. They were sent into servitude, but not as slaves. Over the generations, they came to own black slaves.
What about that famous song, Amazing Grace, written by John Newton in the 18th century and beloved by abolitionists?
I concede it had Ulster origins. Newton was almost shipwrecked off the Donegal coast in 1748, an experience that converted him to Christianity. But it hardly converted him to anti-slavery. He continued trading until 1755. 7 more years.
My point here is that in Ireland, we did not engage in slavery.
Hang on a minute. Didn't the locals here purchase St. Patrick as a slave? Female slaves were a unit of currency in Ireland, and worth a lot more than male ones, I may add. Oh, it's very liberated, that.
That's all ancient history. We're talking the modern era.
All right, let's talk about the modern era. November 1784, in the Belfast Telegraph. Runaway. An Indian black, the property of Thomas Bond, Esquire of Bond's Glen, near Londonderry. Any person apprehending said black, shall receive a suitable reward.
And the immediate response? Struck with just abhorrence at reading an advertisement in the Belfast newsletter, wherein a gentleman presumes to advertise a reward for an Indian black, profanely calling his fellow creature his property, in as cavalier a manner as he would his horse, his dog, or any other animal. We, the members of the Amicable Society of Belfast, do hereby pledge ourselves to our unfortunate fellow creature, the aforementioned Indian black, that we will afford him every protection in our power. Belfast, November 1784.
The Amicable Society didn't have it all its own way. Belfast Mercury, December 1784. We shall present an estimate which an ingenious gentleman of this kingdom some time ago made for the benefit of his countrymen. This estimate details expenses attending the outfit of a vessel fitted out in one of our ports heading for the coast of Africa, namely a ship of 300 tons, double-manned and well-armed, £3,000. Provisions and wages for the voyage to Africa, the West Indies, and then home, £1,000. The cargo of such a vessel might amount to between £3,000 and £4,000, and this is made up of corn spirits, tallow, gunpowder, arms, printed linens and cottons, tobacco, iron and bars, India goods, and Dutch toys to be had here in Belfast as cheap as in Bristol or Liverpool. Now, such a vessel as this might carry 500 to 600 slaves to the West Indies, by which, with the returns in gold dust, elephant's teeth, etc., £20,000 would be produced, over 5 times more. And the whole completed, accidents accepted, within 12 months.
It's all very speculative, very anonymous.
Oh, we know who was behind it. Waddell Cunningham, one of our leading merchants. He made his fortune in the West India trade and owned slave plantations. He even named one of them Belfast. He was one of our rising Presbyterian patriots and a leading volunteer. When Ireland won her mercantile freedom from English trading restrictions in 1781, why wouldn't she use our newfound liberty to enter the slave trade? And who better to organise it than Cunningham?
But it didn't happen. You must know the story of Thomas McCabe, who called himself the Irish slave. When McCabe saw Cunningham's proposal book at the Assembly Rooms, he wrote in it, "May God eternally damn the soul of the man who subscribes the first guinea." And that was the end of it.
More likely that by 1784 it was late in the day to set about establishing a direct slave trading company in Belfast that could compete with Liverpool or Bristol.
Are you belittling the opposition to the slave trade here? Didn't we invite Ulada Equiano here, the most celebrated free slave of his time, to help make the anti-slavery case?
Oh, there was bitter opposition. Thomas Russell, United Irishman and custodian of the Linen Hall Library, makes the case. Are the Irish nation aware that the question of the slave trade is now one of the greatest consequences on the face of the earth? Are they willing to employ their own treasure and their blood in support of that system? Because England has many millions of pounds engaged in it. Do they know that that horrid traffic spreads its influence over the globe, that it creates and perpetuates barbarism and misery, and prevents the spread of civilization and religion in which we profess to believe? Do they know that by it, thousands and hundreds of thousands of these miserable Africans are being dragged from their innocent families, transported to various places, and they're treated with such a system of cruelty, torment, wickedness, and infamy that it is impossible for language adequately to express its horror and guilt. It is the wicked work of demons rather than that of men.
Russell got himself executed.
But not for his opposition to slavery.
Russell and others would not eat sugar because it was a slave product.
Oh, there are many other ways to make a profit from slavery. We may not have traded in slaves, but we supplied the slave colonies. It was the making of the linen industry. And our first industrial revolution in the 1780s and 1790s was based on cotton manufacture. Cotton was a slave plantation product. Even Mary Ann McCracken and her sister were engaged in the business. Ask yourself why Belfast, a town of 20,000, had more than 300 shoemakers. They were making shoes for slaves in the sugar plantations.
Well, it all came to an end in 1807 with the Wilberforce Act.
Not at all. The Act abolished the slave trade in Britain, but slave trade was not abolished in the colonies until 1833.
Well, we did,
30 years later.
Well, we did the decent thing then, didn't we?
We were very decent to the slave owners. They got enormous compensation for the loss of their property. The former slaves got nothing.
What has that got to do with us? We weren't the slave owners.
Some of us were. 14 slave owners in Ulster possessed 5,353 slaves, and they were compensated to the tune of £179,926.
Didn't Belfast provide an enthusiastic welcome to Frederick Douglass in 1845, an escaped slave still technically in the run by US law?
Except for the posters plastered around the town demanding, "Send back the nigger." There were plenty of Belfast Presbyterians depending on funds sent by Presbyterian slave owners in the southern American states for their local missionary work.
How on earth did they justify that?
Oh, the Bible, of course. They cited Peter chapter 2, verse 18. "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourself to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh."
There are also passages in the Bible which support the right of slaves to escape.
Maybe so, but those who supported slavery picked the passages that suited them.
But there were more powerful voices that vehemently opposed slavery, considered the principal stand of the great liberator and father of modern Irish nationalism, Daniel O'Connell. "Shame upon every man in America who is not an anti-slavery man. Shame and disgrace upon him. I don't care for the consequences. I will not restrain my honest indignation of feeling. I pronounce every man a faithless miscreant who does not take a part for the abolition of slavery."
But what about advanced nationalists? What about Ulsterman John Mitchell, young Irelander, author of the Jail Journal, that Bible for Irish separatists? Not only did he support the existing slave regime in the southern states of the US, but he advocated a renewal of the slave trade from Africa.
He got his comeuppance. His second and less celebrated jailing came following the Confederate defeat in the American Civil War. He also sacrificed 2 of his sons in that reactionary cause.
That didn't stop his late Irish career. He was elected as the first abstentionist MP in Tipperary. There's a statue of him in Uri, and GAA clubs are named after him.
Yet surely campaigners against American slavery were still in the ascendant in Belfast. Mary Ann McCracken and her Women's Committee were still there handing out leaflets at the docks.
According to Mary Ann, this was a fading cause. She says, Belfast, once so celebrated for its love of liberty, is now so sunk in the love of filthy lucre that there are but 16 or 17 female anti-slavery advocates and not one man, and none to distribute papers to American emigrants, but an old woman of 89. America, considered the land of the great and the brave, may more properly be styled the land of the tyrant and the slave.
All right. Suppose I concede that it is at best a checkered history, that Irishmen north and south and as immigrants often made the best of the marketplace as they found it. What is the point of an apology now? How will it serve the millions of black Africans who suffered and died in circumstances of unspeakable degradation? Slavery has been abolished.
Child labour, people trafficking, the sex trade.
Everyone is opposed to those things. You're not trying to suggest that we are complicit, are you? Didn't the British government pass a Slavery Act as recently as 2015, banning all of those things?
Yet now our government claims that immigrants are making bogus claims of slavery and wants to tighten the criteria by which such claims are made.
Perhaps some of those claims are bogus.
Oh, wise up, look at the statistics. By one estimate, there are 50 million enslaved people worldwide, and by another, there's 100,000 in the United Kingdom.
How can that be? Don't we recognise the rights of fleeing refugees?
Not in Fortress Europe or with British gunboats repelling foreign invaders in the English Channel.
Surely you're opposed to people trafficking.
Yes, of course. But it is government policy that has made that gruesome industry possible, and one that some of us seek to profit mightily from.
What do you mean?
Oh, the Armagh boys have added it to cigarette smuggling and fuel laundering. You will surely recall the recent horrific case in which dozens of mainly Vietnamese would-be immigrants suffocated to death in the back of an Armagh-run lorry.
You say that we exclude refugees. Haven't we embraced those fleeing Ukraine?
Oh, we say so. But here in Northern Ireland, we make it as difficult as possible for them, what with visa requirements and so on. That is why we have provided sanctuary for less than 1,000 Ukrainians, compared with the more than 50,000 taken by the Republic.
At least we've taken some.
Quite rightly too. But they just so happen to be Christian and white. If you're a refugee from Black Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq or Syria, you're more likely to be sent to Rwanda, especially if you're a Muslim.
Don't we have to have effective controls on immigration?
Perhaps. But don't set impossible limits which effectively deny sanctuary to those in the most desperate need.
But we do admit immigrants if they can play key roles in our economy.
Oh yeah. Until recently we admitted Russian oligarchs and even gave them seats in the House of Lords. But this economic argument is one made to the exclusion of a more fundamental argument, that on behalf of humanity, on behalf of human rights.
So you would let a tide of foreigners in to live off our benefit system?
Hardly. Our benefit system is less generous than in other European countries. They come here to make new lives and to work if they're allowed.
What do you mean if they're allowed?
Immigrants can't work while their cases are being considered, leaving them prey to every kind of exploitation. That is even truer of the so-called illegal immigrants. That is the source of modern day slavery.
Well, what would you do about it?
Defend the rights of refugees and immigrants in every way possible. We could do worse than follow the example of that amicable society which as long ago as the 1780s swore to defend an escaped Indian slave.
So you would open the door to an alien tide?
Aliens come from outer space. These are your fellow humans.
But they are not from here.
Let me take you back to basics. What were the origins of modern slavery? It has a lot to do with here. We sallied forth, captured hundreds of thousands of slaves in Africa, transported them to our colonies, and profited mightily from their slave labour.
I know what you're going to do next. You're going to demand that I make an apology for slavery. Send me on a guilt trip.
More than an apology is needed. Reparations to those countries still burdened by the legacy of slavery would be more in order. I trade your refusal to apologise for a determination to do something about slavery now. You could do worse than remember the old anti-slavery motto used with the image of a chained slave. Am I not a man and a brother? Mind you, it needs amended. Are we not men and women, and your brothers and sisters?
Well, I hope you were pleasantly surprised and inspired. And it was interesting to go back in time, John, and to hear everything to where we are presently. Can I call you two back up for a few minutes, please? I think one of the things, especially we've had today, has been about looking as far back as we can and bringing it forward to present. So I guess we're curious, when you read pieces of script and you have this as you have us sitting in this way, how do you feel? I think I'll find it when I can find it.
I think you're very white. I think you've been, you're very, very aware of race. We've been involved in a lot of various projects over the years, and not just in Ireland, but all around the world. But you're very, very aware of your own race, and your privilege in doing it, I suppose. But I don't know if you.
Yeah, we do a lot of work that deals with the legacy of conflict, really, or looking at human rights and repression. And I think sometimes we find it, we kind of stop ourselves talking about other people's repression. And I think that we need to be having conversations between communities, across communities, about communities, but it's also very important that we put the narrative into context. And I think by looking back, we have a greater understanding of how long it has been going on and the number of individuals involved in it, and that it is something we should be collectively doing about it, you know.
I'm an associate artist at the Global Arts Corps, which is a New York-based company that goes to post-conflict zones and tries to get professional artists together from both sides to try and work together on a piece of theatre to see if that can somehow tell a narrative of what they've been through. And then they bring you out to various countries to work with the professional artists there. And I was in South Africa, and at the end of that, I felt that I was just like another white European telling people what to do. Whereas when I was in Kosovo and looking at talking with actors and directors out there, I felt that I understood it an awful lot more, because it wasn't just about race; it was more a lot of stuff underneath. There was ethnic and religious and so on. So they learn from that, and then they try and get artists that might, more appropriate to whatever projects they're doing. So we did a big project in South Africa on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and it toured, that play toured the world. It was an amazing production.
Well, I think I can relate to that because at a time in my life, there was a time where I served with the United Nations, and part of that was being immersed into communities and seeing the devastation and understanding from that perspective, because in some shape or form, when you're safe and everything is okay, you never think about the danger, do you? But it's when you're in that space and you see the vulnerability and you see how people can be so fundamentally destroyed and traumatized by it, that what you're doing, you're reading a piece of history of which, because we've never lived in that period, we might not understand the severity of that past. So we appreciate that you bring to light this information. And as your organization reflects, reclaim the Enlightenment, I think we all have a responsibility to be as enlightened as we possibly can. And after having spoken to Stephen earlier on today, and him mentioning that Frederick Douglass is one of many free slaves who became abolitionists who came to Northern Ireland. I think in total there's probably over 30, but we only talk about one. I believe there's a statue that's been commissioned for Frederick Douglass, and equally for Mary McCracken, and there's a lot of things that have been positioned. But I think one of the things Stephen echoed was every voice is relevant, and we need to find the missing pieces of that history so that when we have the narrative, I think we're beyond whose fault is it. I think there's a responsibility for where we are presently to act on it better. And we rely on yourselves to bring this to light and to educate us and to fill in those gaps so that fundamentally as a community, we can reflect as better people. So thank you so much for sharing this piece. John, we look forward to perhaps more renditions from yourselves. And oh yeah, he's forever writing. I think we're promised another script shortly. But we appreciate that. And I think today, as it's Black History Month, as we all know. And for most of today, it's quiet in here now, but we had a very active day before. And it was beautiful to look out. And it wasn't about being Black or being white, but it was about being the community that lives in Northern Ireland. And that was a beautiful thing to see. To hear the different speeches, to hear the different aspirations and the hopes, because this is home for us all. And how we learn to hear each other and appreciate each other is significant. So I hope those who sit at the Hill or at any desk of importance could take some time to think about us, who they're accountable to make sure that they do as right as they possibly can and allow us to be part and parcel of that conversation so that we can reflect the Northern Ireland that sees us all and that we belong in it together. So thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you.